Unconventional warfare relies on game theory and the application of mathematical models to anticipate the response to staged provocations. Reactions become perfectly predictable in the sense that they are foreseeable within an acceptable range of probabilities. Israeli mathematician and game theory economist Robert Allman received the 2000 Nobel Prize in Economic Science. Co-founder of the Center for Rationality at Hebrew University, this Jerusalem resident conceded that, and I quote, "The entire school of thought that we have developed here in Israel has turned Israel into the leading authority in this field." I think it's accurate to say that America lost its control over its foreign policy quite some time ago. When the Jewish Zionists went to the Christian Zionist Harry Truman and persuaded him to recognize this syndicate as a legitimate nation state, that really began this. Then you had the ability to be perceived as a legitimate nation state, and I don't think it ever was. I think it's difficult to say you're going to delegitimize Israel when you realize the history of how it came into being. You can't delegitimize something that was a fraud to begin with. So that will sort itself out in time. The problem, of course, is that our foreign policy, this is now so embedded in our foreign policy that our policy is perceived as Israel's policy, and not without some good reason. We just went to war in the Middle East, duped by a supposed ally to go wage war in the Middle East. So this is very challenging. I mean, as an American I was in Vietnam, as an American looking back and saying, oh my gosh, how long has this been ongoing? This is not a modern phenomenon. It's certainly not a new phenomenon. And the war in Iraq is not the first time we've been induced to do something that was against our interest. But if you go back to the common source of this, which is what we're trying to get people to see in this series of books, I think you'll find it all traces to a common source.
And there exists a duplicity, so to say, that is traced to organized crime back to the 1920s. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this is, I mean, if you're I'm a lawyer by training, so when I look through this, people say this is Zionism and whatnot. I think that's accurate to a certain extent, but this is also organized crime operating on a global scale. We had a very robust organized crime in the United States. If you're going to operate on a global scale, it's very handy to have the perception of a legitimate nation state through which to operate. To staff a standing army, an air force, a navy, to dispatch an intelligence corps worldwide, to have non-extradition, that's really important, particularly if you're going to financially pillage a nation as large as the Russians, Russia, and then have so many of those people move to Tel Aviv and whatnot. Very helpful to have non-extradition. So I think at some level that's, again, part of why we call this a criminal state series. It's meant to indicate not only what that state is, the state of mind that brought that about, but also now what's happened to the United States due to this alliance. We look like a criminal state, and that's a great tragedy from my perspective as an American. I'm trying to recover what I know the United States can be from these thugs. I don't know a better term than that, than thugs.
Guilt by association explains how the U.S. was deceived by elites and extremists to wage war in the Middle East. It describes how both deception and self-deceit were essential for this criminality to succeed. The first book in the Criminal State series promises to make treason transparent so that the U.S. national security can be restored and financial security protected from the transnational criminal syndicate chronicled in this account.
What is the Criminal State series?
The Criminal State series is envisioned as a 6-book series. The first one is meant to be a very generic account to explain to people how this operates. How do you displace facts in plain sight where you can't see it? How does that operate? And it was really to be tested out with 2 primary groups. One was the moderate and secular Jews who are saying, thank you so much for doing this. It enables us to see how this operates in plain sight and protect the broader community from those, because we're routinely portrayed as guilty by association because of these thugs within our community. The second group was the most sophisticated people in national security, intelligence primarily, and also the diplomatic corps. And they're coming to us saying, thank you, again, thank you for doing this. It's a generic account. It's meant really to give people the tools of perception so they can see in front of themselves when Wolf Blitzer comes up on your screen as CNN and has anything to do about Israel, you know what you're looking at, okay? You're not looking at the news anymore. You're looking at a propaganda machine. When you pick up the New York Times, and you don't see her anymore, but you saw Judith Miller reporting the so-called news from Ahmad Chalabi, who was an Israeli asset created for this purpose. That was not news. That was propaganda in plain sight. So the question is, when you're living in a country where your governance is dependent on informed choice, how do you enable yourself to see when you're being seduced by something that is not true? And until you have those tools, democracy is in trouble. And right now we're in a lot of trouble in the United States because of this criminal syndicate.
And through your book, you promised to make treason transparent. So the question is, how did treason become so systematic?
Yeah, the treason that we're talking about, I mean, if you look back to the founders and when they founded the United States, you keep in mind you had the Tories who were loyal to the crown, and you had the patriots. Now, how do you tell a Tory from a patriot? Because it's between your ears where your loyalties lie, right? So the founders did something very interesting. You'll see it in the Constitution. They put the evidentiary standards for treason in the Constitution because they're very relaxed. He said, if you're found to be adhering to an enemy or giving an enemy aid and comfort, that's a very relaxed standard from a legal perspective. If you can persuade a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that that's what you're doing, that's a capital offense. That means that's a death penalty. Now, the problem, of course, is most people have as a perception that Israel and the state is a friend of ours and an ally, when the facts, and I think if you'll see the facts in guilt by association, say something very different. This is an enemy within. It's embedded inside our government. We have people who will go by their own beliefs to give help to the state simply because they may be Zionist Christians or they otherwise think that they should somehow help out, including a lot of Jews who've been seduced into this, and a lot of naive Jews who've been seduced into identifying their interest with this sort of thuggish enterprise. So that's this sophisticated form of treason now that we've got to unwind and take action. I think take action very quickly before the same syndicate that took us into Iraq takes us into Iran, takes us into Pakistan, takes us into the next venue.
Charging treason, the question is, how did you present the case for convening grand juries to bring indictment against Israeli operatives from one administration to the other?
Yeah, I think if we had one, honest U.S. attorney who was really willing to follow the evidentiary trail that you will see in guilt by association, and you will see more of it on the website, Criminal State. Just take one honest U.S. attorney, follow that evidentiary trail, convene a grand jury around the charge of treason, pull in a few of the operatives, senior operatives, many of whom are off the radar screen but identified largely in the endnotes to this initial book. Pull in a few of those people, bring in the testimony, and you'll see the pieces of that testimony, again, primarily in the endnotes to the book, and then see what happens. Follow the evidence wherever it goes. If you look at means, motive, opportunity, and stable nation-state intelligence, who could have pulled off this operation inside the United States? There's only one answer to that. The question is having somebody with enough integrity and a much love of this country to really take that on and say, okay, let's convene a grand jury. Let's hear the testimony. Let's see where this goes. I'm hopeful that will happen.